we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Despite constitutional guarantees, American civil rights and liberties are constantly in danger of violation, whether by individuals, corporations, or government institutions. Regardless of whether personal prejudices or national security concerns lie at the root of these violations, challenging them and holding wrongdoers accountable is imperative for the sake of the constitutional integrity and the preservation of the American way. Trial lawyers advocate for awareness, the truth, and a person's right to know. They believe that in the absence of the truth, all of us stand helpless to defend ourselves, our families, our health, and our way of life. Oftentimes, we don't think about or worry about or understand what is happening to another until it happens to us. Deceits have no boundaries. Disease doesn't recognize the color of our skin or our political party's affiliation. When it comes to cover-ups and false allegations by agencies of the state and the federal government, there is not a soul amongst us who does not have a cringing fear of their overwhelming, awesome power. It is at these times that we need experienced and dedicated trial lawyers, the warriors in the courtroom, who are willing to battle for us tooth and nail in the halls of justice to protect our cherished way of life. When a person with disabilities, or anyone else for that matter, calls the police seeking assistance, they expect to receive help. Sadly, people with disabilities and their family members or friends do not always receive the help they expect. In fact, they may receive something that is quite the opposite. People who experience forms of developmental or mental disabilities are oftentimes doubly targeted by police violence due to high rates of poverty and homelessness. The brutal murder of a homeless man with schizophrenia in Fullerton, California, presents what happens when homelessness, mental illness, and police brutality meet. Kelly Thomas was sleeping on the streets when he was murdered. He was approached by 6 police officers in July of 2011. When Kelly allegedly refused to comply with his arrest, 2 police officers held him down, while 4 more police officers took turns beating him with their batons and stunning him with tasers for 8 minutes. The beating left Kelly comatose and disfigured. He died less than a week afterwards. This was what Kelly Thomas looked like just before he died. To be plain, very little information is collected on a national level concerning police injuring and killing of people with disabilities. The problem comes from a larger failure to gather information on a national basis about police injuring and killing civilians as a whole. Police departments either do not collect or are reluctant to collect this kind of information. Reports of police injuring and killing civilians are scattered and imprecise. All across this great nation of ours, we see horrific examples of some cops beating and mistreating persons with developmental or mental disabilities because the cops are not properly trained. More training and better awareness of the complexities of interacting with people with disabilities will help decrease and maybe eliminate these unspeakable crimes against society's less fortunate. In Maryland, Ethan Saylor died because police responded with rapid and unnecessary force to his disability. In San Diego, 21-year-old Antonio Martinez, who has Down syndrome, was walking to his parents' bakery around 8 p.m. when he was stopped, pepper sprayed, and beaten by a San Diego sheriff's deputy. In Los Angeles, an LA County sheriff's deputy was caught on a cell phone camera throwing a punch in a girl's face. What makes it more outrageous is that it is obvious he hit a person with special needs that was struggling to break loose from the grip of the cop and a female deputy as they were trying to make her get off the bus. In Dayton, Ohio, a mentally disabled teen was harassed and abused by a police officer. In Washington, D.C., police assaulted a homeless man in a wheelchair. In Idaho, police arrested and handcuffed an 8-year-old autistic girl. In Hillsborough County, Florida, police were caught by their own surveillance cameras dumping a quadriplegic man from his wheelchair onto the ground. Apparently, they were trying to determine whether or not he actually needed the chair. These are just a few of the hundreds of daily examples improperly trained police officers perpetrate on those less fortunate than us. Americans want to feel safe. Should we continue to accept the argument that cops only occasionally overstep their boundaries and only when handling guilty criminals and never with us? Can we really expect them to investigate and prosecute themselves when faced with allegations of misconduct? Can we believe that they are acting for our own good? Too many innocent people are convicted, too many are wrongfully executed. The cost has become too high for free people to bear. The Department of Justice has reported how deeply embedded police brutality is and why recent political rhetoric promising solutions barely scratches the surface. In this insider-exclusive network TV special, Justice in America, Sidney Gurley's story, our news team visits with David Robinson at Robinson & Associates on location in Detroit, Michigan, to examine the all-too-often abuse of power in our nation's prisons and the tragic case of Sidney Gurley, who died in prison from not receiving adequate medical care, a violation of his Eighth Amendment rights. In the United States, prison officials are obligated under the Eighth Amendment to provide prisoners with adequate medical care. This principle applies regardless of whether the medical care is provided by governmental employees or by private medical staff under contract with the government. Inmates have a right to health care under the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. It is not a right to the best possible health care, but it is a right to at least that level of health care that a civilized society would think necessary. Tragically, many inmates have long been denied even that minimal level of medical and mental health care, with consequences that have been serious and often fatal. Inmates are forced to wait months or years for medically necessary appointments and examinations, and many receive inadequate medical care in substandard facilities. Serious mentally ill inmates languish in horrific conditions without access to necessary mental health care, raising the acuity of mental illness throughout the system and increasing the risk of inmate suicide. A significant number of inmates have died as a result of the failure to provide constitutionally adequate medical care. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Detroit, Michigan. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dave Robinson to the show. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Well, thank you, Steve.
You have an unusual background, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this show. You were a police officer on the Detroit Police Department for, 13 years?
13 years, yes.
What made you decide that you wanted to become a lawyer after serving on the police force so long?
For the most part, I always wanted to be a lawyer. And being a police officer, it was a logical nexus, so to speak, to what it is that I ultimately wanted to do. As a police officer, you get the opportunity to know a little bit about the law. You have an opportunity to, interact and engage with people. And it sort of facilitates the next step of becoming a lawyer, in my opinion. And I saw some very interesting things as a police officer, and that sort of inspired me to do as a lawyer, what I do in the area of police misconduct and civil rights.
Right. Now, you've been a lawyer for 32 years, yeah? What do you see the difference between the police force 30 years ago and the police forces today?
The only difference, literally, is the implements to what goes along with being a police officer, the function of the job. What hasn't changed and what will never change, Steve, is the human factor of how police officers interact with citizens. That can't be changed.
Right.
You can go from a baton to a taser, but the attitude and disposition and personality of a police officer 100 years ago is subject to the same propensities as it is today.
Would you say that the police officers 30, 40 years ago were more constrained to use severe violence? Because today you have weapons of mass destruction. You have machine guns, basically. And I see more so today that officers are more inclined to just unload a magazine on somebody for the slightest reason. You don't see this back in the 60s or the 50s, do you?
Yeah, and you make a very good point, because, when I became a police officer, we had revolvers. You had 6 bullets, and you kept, extra ammunition on your belt.
Yeah.
But the practicality, obviously, of being able to discharge more than 6 bullets in a given situation was very, very challenging, unlike it is today. I mean, you've got semi-automatic weapons. You've even got automatic weapons, for policing. And so, the facility to pull the trigger is greater today than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Most of the cases you deal with are what we call civil rights cases, right?
Correct.
And today we are here to discuss one specific case which deals with the 8th Amendment, and your client was Sidney Gurley, correct? Would you tell our audience a little bit about what happened? Who was Sidney and what happened to him?
Sidney was in jail, in prison for the crime of fleeing and eluding. He had attempted to rob without a weapon a Kentucky Fried Chicken and got caught. And Sidney was a bad crook, for all intents and purposes.
An incompetent crook.
He was the world's most worst.
How do you rob a chicken outfit without a weapon?
Right. Well, and so he got caught.
Yeah.
And he was in prison. He was 46 years old. And he had 2 sons, an estranged wife, mother, sister, and a brother. Sidney was in good health. He was 46 years of age. Just prior to his death, he had a physical, which he was in great shape. He worked out every day.
He was not always a bad guy. He was in the Army.
He was in the Army.
He had some vocational training.
Right. Yes. And he was even, in the time that he was out of jail, he was a very productive guy, because his family supported him, even into being into the entrepreneurial area, along with his sister.
So he ends up going to jail for this crime. What happened?
July 30th, he had went to chow. It was a Friday, and they had hot dogs on the menu, and they liked hot dogs. He liked hot dogs. Shortly after eating that evening, he began to get sick. He just thought he had a bad hot dog. But the problem got worse and worse and worse. And again, this was July the 30th. His problems kept getting worse. He didn't know what was going on. He went to guard at the advice of some of his co-inmates. And the guard said that you have to fill out a kite. The kite process is one where an inmate will request medical help.
In other words, you can't like walk into a doctor's office. You had to make a
written request for it. And the way that works is that the guards, they come pick the kites up, and then they will take them to the nursing or healthcare. Healthcare eventually gets around to assessing the kites and then makes a determination as to whether or not a person is going to get medical treatment, and if so, what kind of medical treatment. So this process can take days. Sidney's condition literally was deteriorating, by the minute. So eventually, a guard who had a heart, Aaron Jones, an African-American guard, saw Sidney's worsening conditions, and despite the fact that it's an attitude in the prison not to get medical help for inmates because it's an inconvenience to the staff, so to speak, Aaron Jones thought differently, and he demanded that Sidney be seen by healthcare. Oh, that was August the 5th. The symptoms, onset was again July the 30th. And what he was suffering from was an appendicitis. When he went to healthcare, he saw a nurse, Fritz, who examined him and only determined that he had a UTI, a urinary tract infection, as opposed to the more serious abdominal issue that was underlying. Sent him back with a prescription for Bactrim, and he suffered all through that night. And then in the morning of August the 6th, he was found dead in his bunk, having suffered from peritonitis.
And then what happened after that?
Of course, there was an autopsy, and they determined that all of his organs had, were necrotic and gangrenous. That disease process was occurring literally from the date of July the 30th. After Sidney's death, quite literally, Nurse Fritz, who had made this misdiagnosis for the UTI, changed the records. In her original clinical examination, she noted that Sidney had 0 bowel sounds. After the death, on the Monday morning, she changed the computer records to say that Sidney had bowel sounds ×4. And what that means is that you could hear digestion in all 4 quadrants of the abdomen, making them look healthy.
So how did you discover, you eventually ended up suing the prison?
We had to sue the prison, absolutely.
How did you discover this change in the medical record?
Well, she was kind of stupid, frankly, because she admitted to making the change, but they tried to suggest that they had a computer malfunction.
Oh, blame it on the computer.
Exactly. But again, this was like destroying evidence is what it was, because it was a crime scene. That's what it was.
And we're going to get more into what happened to this case, but first I want to dwell on a couple of things here. Accountability. You got Nurse Fritz. You have some of these guards that are not helping him when he needs help. What happens to those people? Are they reprimanded? Are their careers destroyed? Are they fired?
They are protected. They are protected. The cover-up goes all the way up to the top, literally. Nobody is called on the carpet. They get away with it. In this case, it's like getting away with murder, literally. And there is no sanction. There is no scrutiny. There is no review.
Nothing goes in their file.
Nothing goes in the file. As a matter of fact, they were determined to not have done anything wrong, frankly.
But Sidney's dead.
And the standard for the type of case is the denial of medical treatment.
Which is the Eighth Amendment.
Eighth Amendment. Persons that are in prison and convicted are protected under the Eighth Amendment for against cruel and unusual treatment.
Which basically means in plain old English that even if you're an inmate, even if you've been convicted of a crime, you're still entitled to reasonable medical care, right?
And it's greater than reasonable. It's the same medical care, it's the same standard inside prison that it is outside of prison. Sidney should have been treated the same as if Sidney was outside the prison suffering from the exact same symptoms, and he could have called 911 for help, and they've taken him to the hospital, and they've properly diagnosed him, and he'd been okay.
And he was about ready to be released from jail, wasn't he?
Yeah, within 30 days or so. He had served his time.
Yeah.
He paid his debt to society.
Right.
And was looking forward to, reuniting.
So when you have all these facts, you and you sue the prison, you sue the state, actually the city, right? Was this a city or state prison?
It was a state prison, but technically you can't sue the state in federal court, so we just were left with suing the individual.
And you have all these facts. What does the opposing counsel say?
Well, again, the two guards, their testimony was that Sidney never appeared to be in distress. Sidney was fine. He was skipping happy, go lucky, and it confounded, and we disputed that, of course, with the medical science, because Sidney's organs had shut down. They were in the disease process, and so his his appendix had already ruptured, and this poison, this toxin, was infiltrating his system. He could not have been fine and not in distress as they purported. But again, those were lies, and those were easily defeatable lies with the experts that we had hired, of course. None of it made sense. So
eventually, you settled the case.
They offered $40,000, Steve.
$40,000. Was that at the beginning?
That was at the beginning.
At the beginning. The $40,000, like, let's go away, right? Let this go away.
$40,000, yeah.
So what did you end up settling the case?
$850,000.
$850,000. Well, congratulations on that. Let's talk about, because when people watch this show, there are many, as you know, there are many times the attitude, I think, of many guards in institutions are, the only good inmate is a dead inmate. I mean, seriously, I've interviewed a lot of them. But they are entitled, let's get back to this reasonable medical care. You say the same medical care as on the outside, correct?
Correct.
Do you think that prisons afford this to inmates?
Absolutely not. Prisons privatize the health care.
Right.
And companies that provide the healthcare services are businesses for profit. And so where they can cut corners in order to buttress their profits, they do so. Right. And routinely, nurses are used to make diagnoses and to give treatment when that is against the law. It's against protocol, for sure. Right. And that's what was going on here. There was even a PA that we sued, a physician's assistant.
Sued them personally.
Right.
And what happened with that case?
We settled her case for $100,000.
Now, what kind of insurance do they have?
They've got good insurance. The state is self-insured, so there wasn't any insurance with the state, but with the PA, there was insurance. So.
Because you handle a lot of civil rights cases, and this is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
What's the definition of civil rights?
Civil rights is something that goes back to Federal Statute 1871. And today, the civil rights does not have the same historical implication that it did back then following, slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation. Nonetheless, the rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution and are protected by certain federal statutes for reasonable searches and reasonable conditions of confinement, reasonable medical treatment, they are subsumed under this historical and very significant law, and under the rubric of, again, civil rights and the protection of the individual integrity, right, bodily integrity of our citizens.
Having been a lawyer for a police officer for 13 years, and now seeing the other side and suing the police departments, why is it important to have a lawyer when you file a case or when you have a legitimate claim against any law enforcement agency?
The law is an intricate beast, and maneuvering your way through that is very, very complicated. It can be complicated. There are so many protections, Steve, that the law for immunities that are afforded to law enforcement officers and qualified immunity and state immunities, navigating your way through those things and around those things to get to the nugget, so to speak, of what puts them on the hook is very, very difficult. So you need a lawyer to do it.
And you have an absolute right to demand one, right?
In a civil case, you don't. In a criminal case, obviously you do, right? But not in a civil case.
Any parting words on Sidney's case?
Absolutely. One of the components to our resolution, given the egregiousness of what it is that occurred and the obvious failure on the part of the guards that were responsible for his care, who really giving them the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say that they looked at Sidney despite his overt suffering and said, "Hey, you're okay." Well, something was amiss there. Either they aren't human, or they simply haven't been trained to, interpret and to discern certain illnesses. When you look at the written policy, it's very, very generic. If a person needs help, get it, right? So unless it's very obvious, blood oozing out, you need help. Right. Sidney's was just as desperate, but it was inside. Yeah. And so you can get away with saying, yeah, to me, he looked fine. Yeah. And it'd be a lie. But what we want to do is to establish more precise guidelines, and we are under our resolution are able to make these suggestions to the Department of Corrections in order for officers to be more insightful and more discerning with regard to an individual's request for help.
Well, congratulations on getting the settlement for their family. They certainly deserved it. No money can ever replace, a human being. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.